There are moments in history when a single sound, a single smell, or a single image distills an entire kingdom's fear into something tangible, something physical, something that creeps into the marrow of those who witness it. And for the servants and courtiers who lived inside Henry VIII's palace in the final decade of his life, that moment arrived every dawn when they gathered outside the king's private chamber, clutching linen cloths soaked in vinegar against their noses, whispering prayers under their breath, and waiting for the royal command to enter a room so thick with the stench of decay that it seemed less like a bedroom and more like the lair of some wounded beast struggling to keep death at bay. Because by then, Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, the sportsman, the scholar, the warrior, had become something unrecognizable, something swollen, infected, angered, and terrified of the very shadow he cast, a monstrous fusion of power and pain whose body had betrayed him long before his mind followed. And yet, to understand how England's most infamous king came to rot from the inside out, you must go back to the moment his transformation truly began, a moment not written in triumph or ceremony, but in blood-soaked sand beneath the hooves of a horse on a cold January morning in 1536, when Henry, armored in glory, rode into a jousting match that would change the fate of England for generations. The lance shattered, the horse stumbled, the king fell. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, motionless, pale, and silent, while panic swept across the court, because for those 120 minutes, England teetered on the brink of chaos, believing its monarch dead. And though Henry eventually opened his eyes, the man who rose from that collapse was not the man who had fallen. Something inside him had ruptured, perhaps his brain, perhaps his spirit, perhaps both, and those closest to him whispered that the kindness, charm, and easy laughter that once defined him slowly vanished, replaced by mood swings so violent that even seasoned diplomats flinched at the sudden shift in his voice. Physicians today believe he suffered a traumatic brain injury, a wound invisible to the eye but devastating to the mind. From that moment on, his temper grew sharper, his paranoia deeper, and his decisions more drenched in blood. And as his mind unraveled, so too did his body. The ulcers came first, angry, swollen lesions on his legs that refused to heal, oozing pus, stubborn against every treatment, emitting a smell so foul it clung to clothing and lingered in corridors. He had been injured in jousts before, but this time the wound festered, tunneled, and reopened endlessly, turning his legs into a battlefield he could not escape. Courtiers wrote that when the king walked, he winced with every step, and when he sat, attendants could hear fluid shifting beneath the bandaged flesh, as if something inside his leg were alive and rotting. Some nights he screamed from the pain. Some nights he roared in anger at physicians who dared to touch the wounds. And on the darkest nights, when the fever took him, he muttered to empty corners of the room, accusing shadows of betrayal, seeing danger where none existed. By his late 40s, Henry's weight surged past anything the kingdom had ever seen in a ruler. He grew so large that tailors had to invent new measurements just to keep up. His once athletic frame ballooned to nearly 400 pounds, his waist reaching an astonishing 54 inches, wider than the height of some of the children who served in his household. His armor had to be widened again and again until finally he could no longer wear it. The king, who once raced through forests on horseback, now struggled to walk across a room. The king, who once leapt into the jousting arena like a lion, now required specially built mechanical chairs, pulleys, and teams of servants just to move him. His legs could no longer support the weight of his own crown. Modern scholars suspect Cushing syndrome, a hormonal disorder that explains the swelling, the purple blotches on his skin, the mood swings that rattled the court, and the wounds that refused to close. Whatever the cause, Henry became a prisoner of his own flesh, trapped, suffocating, drowning inside a body that decayed faster than medicine could save him. Yet he refused humility. He refused defeat. He refused to let anyone, even for a moment, see him as weak. He hid the agony behind roaring laughter that echoed across feasts. He hid the infection behind mountains of silk and velvet. He hid the swelling behind layers of gold, jewels, and ceremony. But no amount of splendor could disguise the truth. When he walked, the court heard him before they saw him, the thud of his steps accompanied by pained breaths and the faint, sickening smell of rot. Servants stuffed herbs into his boots. They filled his chamber with rose water, incense, lavender, and mint, anything to mask the odor that seeped from his body, as if death itself had taken residence within him. But nothing worked. The stench became a legend whispered across Europe, a warning that England's lion had become something far more tragic and terrifying, a king who was rotting while still alive. Yet the tragedy was not only physical, for as his flesh dissolved, his trust evaporated, his suspicions multiplied, his temper sharpened like a blade. He fired servants who looked at him too long. He accused allies of treason for hesitating before speaking. He forced interrogators to torture confessions from men who had never plotted anything beyond survival. And every new execution, every new betrayal, every new spiral of violence fed a cycle of paranoia that looped endlessly inside his fevered mind. By the time he reached his final decade, Henry VIII was no longer feared merely as a king. He was feared as a force of unpredictable destruction, a man whose rage could reduce a noble family to ashes in a single afternoon, a ruler so consumed by pain and suspicion that even his children were watched through keyholes, their letters read, their conversations noted, their loyalty questioned. England had no monarch. It had a storm wearing a crown, and as the king sat on his throne, gasping under the weight of his own body, feeling the ulcer on his leg pulse like a second heartbeat, he realized something he would never admit aloud. His body was dying faster than his power could protect him. The rot had begun, and soon it would consume everything. There is a corridor in Hampton Court Palace where the past seems to cling to the walls like damp air trapped between stone and memory, a long, echoing passage lined with portraits that have outlived the beating hearts they once tried to honor. And when you walk through that hallway and face the painted faces of Henry VIII's 6 wives, each beautiful, each hopeful, each unaware of the storm, they would one day marry you, feel the heavy truth that their lives were not romantic chapters in a royal fairy tale, but tragedies carved into the marble floors by fear, manipulation, and the violent unpredictability of a king whose mind and body were collapsing faster than the kingdom could understand. Because to marry Henry VIII was not to become a queen. It was to be swallowed by a shadow. It was to stand beside a man who could grant you a crown at dawn and a death warrant before dusk. It was to sleep beside a monarch whose nightmares spilled into waking life, whose paranoia hunted every whisper, whose rage demanded sacrifice. Catherine of Aragon knew this before anyone else. She married the charming prince, not the monster he would become, yet she spent her final years in cold, isolated rooms far from court, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, and slowly drained of hope. Letters hint she may have been poisoned, not quickly, but slowly, cruelly. The kind of death that leaves a woman wondering whether the pain in her chest is illness or the king's final retaliation for refusing to disappear. Anne Boleyn suffered a fate more theatrical and more horrifying. Once the center of Henry's universe, she watched that universe collapse almost overnight as the king's moods shifted from infatuation to suspicion to unbridled fury. She was forced to witness the arrest, torture, and execution of innocent men, including her own brother, accused of crimes too obscene and impossible to be believed. Her last days were spent in a tower room where she prayed not for freedom, but for a death swift enough to spare her further humiliation. When her head fell beneath the French sword, Henry feasted in celebration before her body had even cooled. Then came Jane Seymour, gentle and unprepared for the darkness that surrounded the king, dying only days after giving birth to his long-awaited son, her body collapsing under the weight of childbirth, while Henry began searching for his next wife scarcely a week after her burial, as if grief were a luxury he no longer had the patience to indulge. Anne of Cleves survived not by strength, but by strategy. When Henry rejected her, calling her unattractive and unworthy, she understood immediately that defiance meant death. She agreed to the humiliating annulment, surrendered her role, and fashioned herself into something the king found far less threatening: a sister, a harmless presence, a woman who bowed just enough to avoid the sword. She alone escaped with her life because she learned faster than the others that Henry's moods were death sentences disguised as royal commands. But the cruelest tragedy belonged to Catherine Howard, the teenage girl barely 15 when she caught Henry's aging eye. Her past, a past filled with youthful mistakes rather than crimes, was turned against her with venom so calculated it became a new law designed specifically for her ruin. When Henry learned of her previous relationships, he reacted not with reason, but with the fury of a man whose pride outweighed mercy, and Catherine was dragged to the block begging for forgiveness, condemned by a king nearly old enough to be her grandfather. Her screams were said to echo long after her body fell. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, intelligent, cautious, and painfully aware that one wrong phrase could cost her life. She survived only by outmaneuvering Henry's paranoia, flattering him during his decline, and suppressing her own beliefs when the king's spies turned their attention toward her. Each wife lived inside a labyrinth of fear. Each wife walked halls where footsteps behind them sounded like approaching doom. Each wife slept, knowing a single accusation, true or imagined, could end everything. Henry's sickness did not just destroy his body, it infected his marriages, it poisoned his households, it turned his wives into prisoners of his temper, his fantasies, and his dread of betrayal. And as the king grew heavier, angrier, and more unpredictable, the women closest to him became mirrors reflecting the consequences of power mixed with madness. Their stories were not romantic tragedies. They were warnings etched into the very foundation of the Tudor dynasty. Because in the end, Henry VIII did not simply marry 6 women. He consumed them. He consumed their youth, their innocence, their dreams, their bodies, and their futures. And long after their portraits stopped breathing, the shadow he cast remained. There are scenes in history so extravagant, so grotesque, and so drenched in theatrical excess that they stop feeling like moments lived by human beings and begin to resemble myths born from nightmares. And the nightly feasts inside Henry VIII's court belong to that strange territory where reality bends into something surreal, where torches flicker against towering tapestries, where shadows writhe across stone walls like living creatures, and where the king, swollen, wheezing, drenched in sweat, presided over a kingdom of meat, wine, superstition, and fear, as if the act of eating itself were a performance meant to reassure the world that he still ruled, still dominated, still existed. Because by the final decade of his reign, Henry could no longer hunt, joust, or ride without agony, but he could eat, and so his feasts became battlegrounds, his hunger became ritual, and the table became the last place where he felt powerful, immortal, untouchable, and feared. Imagine entering the great hall on one of those nights. The air is thick with roasted flesh. Smoke curls upwards in heavy spirals, turning the ceiling into a shifting cloud of haze. Dozens of musicians attempt to fill the acoustic void with harps and drums, but even their music cannot drown out the sound of knives scraping against bone, of goblets slamming onto oak tables, of Henry's breathing echoing louder than the trumpets that announce each course. 5,000 calories a day, roasted boar, whole pigs glazed in honey, mountains of bread, pies stuffed with swan or peacock, rivers of wine, vats of ale, platters piled with chickens, veal, oysters, venison, mullets, and trout. Over 800 dishes prepared daily by armies of cooks, bakers, brewers, and butchers. And Henry tasted dozens of them, not because hunger commanded him, but because superstition told him these foods made him strong, virile, protected. He believed swan meat carried grace. He believed venison sharpened the hunter's soul. He believed oysters fed desire and potency. He ate not for pleasure, but for magic. Yet beneath this pagan spectacle of gluttony lay something darker, something quieter, something far more revealing, his unrelenting fear of poison. Every dish that approached him had already passed through the mouths of royal tasters ordered to chew, swallow, and wait 30 minutes while Henry watched them with cold, suspicious eyes. If they did not collapse, the food reached his plate. If they coughed or paled, the dish was thrown into the fire, and the cook could be questioned, imprisoned, or worse. His paranoia transformed the kitchens into fortresses, guarded more tightly than the royal treasury. Recipes were locked away. Ingredients were monitored like contraband. The smallest spice could spark panic. Even water was tasted before he touched it. And as the king's fear grew, so did his rules. No turnips, too common, too peasant, too beneath the divine stomach of a monarch. No barley, unworthy of royal digestion. No weak foods that might diminish his myth. Even dangerous vegetables were banned from the royal table, dismissed as unfit for a king of God's choosing. All of it, the excess, the superstition, the paranoia, created a spectacle that dazzled foreign diplomats and terrified English servants. Because Henry did not simply sit at the table, he dominated it. He ate with a ferocity that made onlookers avert their gaze, as though witnessing something private, primal, and forbidden. He wiped grease from his chin with the back of his hand. He laughed with a sound that echoed like thunder trapped inside a cavern. He leaned back in his chair, breath rattling, eyes glossy, face flushed, looking less like a king and more like an ancient idol fed offerings to keep it from turning on its worshippers. Some nights, he ate until sweat pooled beneath his clothes. Other nights, he demanded dish after dish, as if filling the emptiness inside him could silence the ghosts of wives he condemned, friends he executed, and enemies he imagined. And when the feast ended after hours of consumption, after the musicians' fingers bled, after the torches sputtered into embers, Henry would signal the end not with gratitude, but with a simple, exhausted gesture, the wave of a swollen hand that dismissed hundreds of servants into the night, leaving the king alone at the head of a table strewn with bones, spilled wine, and the echo of his own hunger. A hunger not for food, but for certainty, for power, for control, for the illusion that he was still the man he once had been. Because dining with Henry VIII was not witnessing a king revel in luxury. It was watching a dying man try to gorge himself on the one thing slipping through his fingers faster than his body could endure his mortality. There is a moment in every tyrant's life when even power, fear, and ceremony can no longer disguise the truth. A moment when the crown loses its weight, when the throne grows cold, and when the body that once commanded armies can no longer command breath. And in the final weeks of Henry VIII's life, that moment arrived with a cruelty so severe that even the servants who had survived his wrath for decades whispered that the king was being consumed not by illness, but by something darker, by the very sins, betrayals, and terrors he had inflicted upon a kingdom that now waited in suffocating silence for his final breath. By then, Henry could not walk. He could not stand. He could barely speak without choking on the weight of his own swollen body. He was carried everywhere on a massive, specially constructed chair, lined with cushions that quickly soaked with sweat, blood, and the sickly fluid leaking from the ulcers on his legs. Ulcers so deep and infected that every movement caused pieces of decayed flesh to peel away, leaving trails that horrified the attendants forced to follow behind him. The stench was otherworldly. Physicians tried packing the wounds with moss soaked in wine. They tried lancing them. They tried poultices of honey, butter, herbs, alchemy, and desperation wrapped in linen, but nothing could stop the spreading infection. Nothing could silence the groans that escaped Henry's throat. Nothing could halt the slow, grotesque collapse of a body that had once been the symbol of English strength. Even his closest attendants approached him with dread. They wore perfumed cloths over their mouths. They averted their eyes. Some fainted, some vomited. One collapsed while bandaging his leg and never returned to service. And still, Henry clung to life, clutching the arms of his chair, his eyes wild with fear, as if convinced that surrendering to sleep would allow his enemies, real or imagined, to finally claim their vengeance. His paranoia sharpened as his body decayed. He ordered guards outside his chamber day and night. He kept weapons near his bed, convinced assassins lurked in the darkness. He snapped at shadows. He accused servants of plotting. He whispered to himself, arguing with memories that no longer obeyed him. The king, who once terrified Europe, now terrified only himself. And when the bleeding, swollen mass that had once been his legs turned purple and black, when fever burned through his flesh like a torch dropped in dry straw, when even touching him caused him to howl with agony, the physicians finally admitted in whispers what the court already knew. Henry VIII was dying, slowly, painfully, grotesquely, but even death refused to grant him dignity. When the end finally arrived in the deep hours before dawn, with only a handful of trembling servants in the room, Henry's body released a foul final breath, and the chamber grew quiet in a way that frightened everyone present. Because for the first time in decades, the king was truly still. Yet the horror did not end with his death. In many ways, it began anew. His corpse swelled rapidly from trapped gases and infection, forcing the embalmers to seal him into a lead-lined coffin thick enough to contain the decay. But even lead could not restrain the chemical rage brewing inside his flesh. During the funeral procession, slow, ceremonial, surrounded by fearful whispers, the coffin buckled, cracked, and then ruptured with a sickening burst, spilling decomposing fluids onto the floor of the church and sending attendants scrambling in shock as dogs wandered forward, sniffing, drawn by the scent of a king who had spent his life believing he was above the world that now consumed him like any other mortal body. They resealed the coffin. They tried again, but even the burial resisted them. The ground caved, the soil shifted, the weight of the coffin threatened to break the ropes, and when they finally lowered him into his tomb, hurried, shaken, sweating, the chapel walls echoed not with reverence, but with unease, because many claimed that in the nights afterward, strange noises seeped from beneath the floor, and a foul odor drifted upward as if the king's body continued its violent rebellion against containment. Several servants who handled the coffin died shortly after from sudden fevers, fueling whispers that Henry's corpse carried a curse, that the rot he spread in life continued spreading in death. The truth, however, was simpler and more terrible. Henry VIII had not died like a king. He had died like a warning about power without restraint, about appetite without limit, about ego without conscience, about a man who ruled with fear, lived with paranoia, and left behind a legacy of broken wives, orphaned children, bankrupt coffers, and a kingdom exhausted by his appetites. And as the stone sealed over him, and the torches dimmed, and the mourners walked away in stiff, uneasy silence, England seemed to exhale for the first time in years, not with grief, but with the quiet, cautious relief of a people who had finally survived their own king. because in the end, Henry VIII could conquer nations, crush wives, rewrite religion, and reshape history, but he could not conquer the one enemy that hunted him from the moment his body began to rot. He could not conquer himself.